On August 16, 1780, the British Army believed the American Revolution in the South was already over. General Charles Cornwallis had just annihilated the Continental Army at Camden, South Carolina, scattering an entire field force in less than an hour. British officers were so confident the war was won that Lord Cornwallis began drafting plans to march north into North Carolina, treating the Carolinas as pacified territory behind him. What Cornwallis did not know was that a 50-year-old farmer with a limp, commanding fewer than 30 men, had already been operating in the swamps behind British lines for weeks and would go on to make the entire region ungovernable for nearly 2 years. So how did a man with no formal military training, no real army, and no fortress to defend manage to humiliate the most feared general in the British Army again and again in territory the British controlled on every map without ever being run to ground? By the summer of 1780, the American cause in the South was close to collapse. Charleston had fallen in May, and with it, over 5,000 Continental soldiers, the worst American surrender of the entire war. Then came Camden in August, where General Horatio Gates's army of roughly 3,000 men was routed by a British force half its size, losing hundreds dead and over 1,000 captured. South Carolina's organized resistance had effectively ceased to exist. Cornwallis controlled the major towns, the roads, and the rivers. He had instituted a network of fortified outposts designed to hold the interior and crush any partisan resistance through a brutal policy of confiscation, public hangings, and the burning of rebel-sympathizing farms. The British strategy depended entirely on one assumption: that without a Continental Army in the field, the South had no organized force left capable of threatening their supply lines or their control of the countryside. If that assumption held, Cornwallis could march into North Carolina and Virginia with his rear secured. If it didn't, if even a small, mobile force could keep striking from territory the British considered tamed, the entire Southern campaign's timeline, supply chain, and manpower allocation would be thrown into chaos. The British did not realize that the man who would make that assumption collapse had already been quietly building a network of local farmers, hunters, and former militiamen who knew the swamps of the PD River region better than any British officer ever would. Francis Marion was not, by any measure, an obvious candidate to become the most feared partisan commander in North America. Born around 1732 in St. John's Parish, South Carolina, to a family of modest Huguenot descent, he was a small, sickly child, by some accounts so frail at birth that he was not expected to survive infancy. He grew into a quiet, unremarkable plantation farmer, a man more comfortable managing rice fields and cattle than commanding men. His one piece of formal military experience came decades earlier, fighting Cherokee forces in the French and Indian War, an experience that, crucially, taught him how to fight in dense, unfamiliar terrain against an enemy who didn't form up in neat lines. That lesson would matter more than anyone could have predicted. By the time the Revolution reached South Carolina, Marion was already in his late 40s, walking with a permanent limp from a leg injury suffered jumping from a second-story window during a Charleston dinner party in 1779, an injury that, in a stroke of grim luck, kept him away from Charleston when the city fell to the British in May 1780, and away from Camden in August when Gates's army was destroyed. While nearly every other senior American commander in the region was killed, captured, or scattered, Marion was recovering at a relative's home in North Carolina, his small force of irregulars intact. What made Marion effective wasn't conventional soldiering. It was patience, discipline, and an almost obsessive understanding of terrain. He knew the PD River swamps, the Santee River Delta, and the dense pine barrens of the South Carolina interior the way a city dweller knows their own street. He recruited not soldiers, but neighbors, farmers who could vanish into the swamp after a raid and reappear at their own dinner tables looking like nothing had happened. One documented detail captures the man precisely. Marion reportedly served a captured British officer a meal of plain sweet potatoes roasted on coals, with no other food on offer, because it was genuinely all his men had. And the officer was reportedly so struck by the contrast between British luxury and the privation Marion's men endured willingly that he later wrote about it as evidence the rebellion could not be starved out. Marion drank little, rarely raised his voice, and insisted on strict discipline regarding the treatment of civilians and prisoners, a deliberate contrast to the brutal tactics being used by British and Loyalist forces, one that steadily won him support even among South Carolinians who hadn't initially picked a side. His small mounted band rarely numbered more than 70 men at any one time, often far fewer. They had no uniforms, minimal ammunition, and almost no formal supply chain. What they had was mobility, local knowledge, and a commander who refused to fight battles he couldn't win. Marion understood something the British High Command never accounted for: that occupying territory and controlling it were not the same thing. Cornwallis's strategy assumed that holding towns, garrisoning outposts, and defeating organized armies in open battle meant the countryside itself was secured. Marion recognized that the swamps, rivers, and back roads the British considered impassable wilderness were, to men who'd farmed and hunted there their whole lives, a highway. One that let him strike a target and disappear before any British response could even be organized. The British couldn't garrison every crossroads. They couldn't chase a force that knew exactly which swamp trail would swallow a column of regular infantry. Marion's insight wasn't a single brilliant maneuver. It was the realization that an enemy with overwhelming conventional strength has no answer for an opponent who simply refuses to be where that strength can be applied. Marion's operations followed a deliberate, repeatable pattern, refined over dozens of raids between late 1780 and early 1781. It began with intelligence, a network of local sympathizers, including women who were rarely searched by British patrols, who passed word of troop movements, supply convoys, and the locations of Loyalist militia gathering points. This wasn't formal espionage with codes or dead drops in the European sense. It was something rougher and, in its own way, just as effective. A web of trust built farm by farm, family by family, across a region the British assumed was simply too rural to organize. Once a target was identified, a supply wagon train, a small garrison, a Loyalist muster, Marion's men would gather at a prearranged rendezvous point deep in the swamp, often Snow's Island, a nearly inaccessible piece of high ground surrounded by the PD River and connected to the mainland only by routes Marion's men had scouted and the British had not. From there, the raid itself was fast. Marion preferred dawn or dusk strikes, hitting a target hard with mounted men, inflicting maximum disruption in minutes, then withdrawing immediately, never holding ground, never lingering to loot or celebrate. The escape was the part that broke the British. Marion's columns would split into smaller groups the moment a raid concluded, each peeling off toward a different swamp crossing, reconverging only at Snow's Island days later. Pursuing British cavalry would chase a trail that simply dissolved into water and reeds. One famous pursuit in November 1780 saw British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a man with a fearsome reputation for running down rebel forces, chase Marion's band for over 25 miles through the PD swamps without ever closing the distance. Tarleton eventually abandoned the chase in frustration. Here's the moment that mattered most. One wrong turn into open ground, one captured courier, one local farmer who talked under pressure, and the entire network would have unraveled in days. Communication between Marion and his scattered network relied on simple, deniable methods. A verbal message passed farm to farm, a specific gate left open or closed as a signal, a particular hymn whistled to identify a friendly approach. none of it would have impressed a European intelligence service. All of it worked because it was tailored precisely to terrain and trust the British could never replicate. If you're finding the sheer patience behind this kind of operation fascinating, this is exactly the kind of hidden, overlooked history we dig into every week. The spies, codes, and deceptions that decided wars while everyone else was watching the battlefield. Marion never engaged in pitched battle if he could avoid it. He attacked only when the odds clearly favored him, and he taught his men, most of whom had never fired a shot in anger before 1780, to think the same way. Discipline over heroics. Withdrawal over glory. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the first sustained American demonstrations of what would later be called guerrilla warfare, decades before the term existed. From Cornwallis's headquarters, the situation looked entirely different and entirely under control. The British had crushed 2 American field armies in 3 months. Bannister Tarleton, sent specifically to hunt down Marion in November 1780, was already famous and feared for his ruthless efficiency in running down rebel forces, having earned a brutal reputation after the Waxhaws massacre earlier that year. Tarleton was so confident in his ability to corner Marion that after the failed 25-mile chase through the swamps, he reportedly dismissed his quarry with open contempt, reportedly remarking that he refused to keep chasing the old swamp fox any further, a nickname meant as an insult, dripping with the implication that Marion was beneath a real soldier's attention. The name stuck, but not in the way Tarleton intended. Within months, the swamp fox was being used by Marion's own men with pride. British officers genuinely believed that a man with no formal command structure, no artillery, no fixed base, and rarely more than a few dozen followers simply could not be a serious strategic problem. That assumption was the entire vulnerability. Cornwallis kept planning his northern campaign as though South Carolina's interior was secured, never fully reallocating the manpower needed to actually pacify the swamp country, because doing so would have meant admitting that a farmer with a limp was tying down resources the British Army couldn't spare. By late January 1781, Marion's raids had become so disruptive that the British dispatched a sizable force under Colonel Wellbore Ellis Doyle to finally locate and destroy his base on Snow's Island. Marion, alerted by his network days in advance, made a decision that would define the entire campaign. Rather than defend the island, he abandoned it. Picture it. Scouts arrive at the swamp's edge near midnight, breathless, reporting Doyle's column on the move. Marion gathers his officers in the dark, by the dim light of a low fire shielded from view. There is no debate about standing and fighting. The decision takes minutes. Supplies that can be carried are loaded onto horses. What can't be moved, including a stockpile of ammunition and provisions Marion's men had spent months accumulating, is destroyed rather than left for the British to find or use as bait. By dawn, the camp is empty. When Doyle's men finally reach Snow's Island, they find smoldering ruins and nothing else. No prisoners, no captured leader, no decisive victory to report back to Cornwallis. Marion's force has already scattered into smaller units across multiple swamp systems, reconvening later at a new, unmarked location the British have no knowledge of. This is the moment that defined Marion's entire war. The willingness to lose ground, supplies, even a hard-won base, rather than risk the one thing that couldn't be replaced: his men. The British had won a hollow tactical victory and gained nothing. Within weeks, Marion's raids resumed elsewhere along the PD, as if Snow's Island had never mattered. Cornwallis, by this point, had already begun his fateful march toward Virginia, a campaign that would end 7 months later at Yorktown, partly because he could never fully trust that his rear in the Carolinas was secure. The measurable impact of Marion's campaign still strikes historians as disproportionate to his resources. Operating with a force that rarely exceeded 70 men and was frequently far smaller, Marion tied down thousands of British and Loyalist troops across roughly 2 years of sustained partisan activity in South Carolina, forcing Cornwallis to divert manpower, cavalry, and attention that could otherwise have reinforced his northern campaign. Marion's brigade fought in more than 24 documented engagements and skirmishes between 1780 and 1782, frequently inflicting casualties or capturing supplies while suffering minimal losses themselves. He was never decisively defeated in the field, and his base was never successfully destroyed with him in it, despite repeated, dedicated British efforts specifically tasked with that goal. Historians still debate exactly how many British resources were ultimately diverted because of Marion's continued activity, precisely because so much of his impact was psychological and logistical, rather than the kind of body count that gets neatly recorded in official dispatches. Disruption that's almost impossible to fully quantify, but that contemporary British officers themselves complained about in writing. Francis Marion's campaign didn't single-handedly win the Revolutionary War, but it bought something the American cause desperately needed in 1780 and 1781: time, and proof that the South hadn't been pacified. While Continental forces under Nathaniel Greene rebuilt in the months after Camden, Marion's continued raids forced Cornwallis to fight a two-front problem he never fully solved, contributing to the strategic drift that eventually carried the British Army to Yorktown and surrender in October 1781. It's a pattern that echoes far beyond the Carolinas. The same basic principle would resurface in different forms in partisan and guerrilla campaigns for the next 2 centuries. An occupying force with overwhelming conventional strength struggles badly against an opponent who refuses to fight on the occupier's terms. Marion survived the war, returned to his plantation, served in the South Carolina State Senate, and died quietly in 1795. A far less dramatic ending than his wartime legend might suggest, with no grand recognition during his own final years beyond the regard of the men who'd served under him. It would take another century and a half and a wave of 20th century popular histories and dramatizations for the Swamp Fox to become a household name far beyond South Carolina. Today, Snow's Island itself is largely reclaimed by the swamp that once hid it, accessible mainly to historians and a handful of South Carolina State Park visitors. A quiet, waterlogged footnote to a campaign that helped change the outcome of a war, sitting almost exactly as inaccessible now as it was in 1781.